Hi, this is your instructor, Teresa Pelkie. Welcome to our class.
Welcome to our next class. We are covering a bit this week. Selectors and certain selectors, which you might read as being called filters, methods, and event methods. The author calls events event methods, so I'm using that same terminology. Alright, we have already looked at jQuery selectors, the ability to manipulate anything on the page. And jQuery uses the same selectors as CSS does. So if you look at some of the selectors that I have here, we have attribute selectors, which we will cover, and we have these other selectors which are equivalent to our structural pseudo classes in CSS. The first child, the nth child, even, odd, etc. And when you have these selectors with the colons, a lot of people will call these filters. So you may see these referred to as filters in other text. This is an example of an attribute selector where the name of the attribute is inside brackets. Now that attribute can be tied into an HTML element also, or another selector. So here we have 3 A elements. They all contain a title attribute. Therefore, we can apply a CSS color to them. I use CSS color a lot because it's easy to see the selection. And here the attribute could be tied in to an element. So here this selector attribute would only apply to this certain element. We also have an attribute selector that indicates an exact value. And this is an example. Some commonly used selectors or filters, the first and last. If you take a look at the UL element here, we have 4 list items. And we could select the first one and the last using these selectors or filters. Another commonly used selector or filter is even. So again, looking at our unordered list, there are 5 items, and if we were applying the even selector to the LI element, notice that the first one would be selected. That is because when you're counting, you start at 0. So even would be 0, 2, 3, 4, etc. The nth child selector works a little differently than the even odd selectors. So if you look at our unordered list and the selector that we're using is the nth child and we want the third one, in this case counting is going to start at 1 because we have to start at something, the first child. There is no 0 child. The not selector will select everything except whatever selector is being passed to not. So here is an example where we would select every LI element except for the first because we have not. Methods. Last week we looked at methods being able to set and get properties and values. Some very commonly used jQuery methods. The next and previous method, which can take a selector, also referred to as transversal methods because they allow us to move up and down the DOM, and they will be covered again in a later chapter. The attr method allows us to set and retrieve attribute values. We have already looked at the CSS method, allowing us to set and retrieve CSS property values. The addClass, removeClass, and toggleClass methods, they allow us to, what they say, manipulate the classes. The hide and show method, and these will be covered in the next chapter, also referred to as effect methods, allow us to hide and show. The each method is essentially a built-in loop allowing us to iterate over something. Alright, so let's take a look at the attribute method, attr. And in this case, we are passing it two parameters, the name and the value. So this is an example where the method is going to set something. So if we wanted to set an attribute to this a tag, so if we look at the bottom here we have ahref equals the jQuery URL. Now, if that was on your web page, you would want to target that into a new window. So you could do that dynamically by using the aSelector.attr method and passing it the name of the attribute and the value to which you want that set. Now, sometimes you really don't know whether this worked or not because we're writing HTML or rewriting HTML. So the best thing to do is to go into the Firebug add-on and look at the HTML console so that you can actually see that indeed your attribute and value are being set. We also can use the attribute method attr to retrieve a value. So here again, if you look at the bottom of this slide, we have our same URL. And supposing we wanted to retrieve the value of the href attribute, which is a URL. Alright, our first line of code, in order to retrieve it, we have to be able to show it somewhere. So we'll use an alert. We'll write our expression, our selector, $a, .attr, and in parentheses the name of the attribute, which is href. And this is an example of getting a value. We will retrieve the value of href, store it in a variable, and if we alert that variable, we will see that indeed we have retrieved that value. So here again, our alert is a good friend to showing you that your code is returning something valuable. Adding a class. Usually we don't use the CSS method to manipulate things. We usually add and remove classes. It's a lot easier and cleaner. So here we have, if you look at the bottom of the page, we have a simple H2. And in our style element here, we have defined a class called color red, and it sets the color property to red. In our jQuery, we have the h2selector.addClass. So we're adding this class to the h2selector color red. Now notice one thing. When we add the class, we're adding the name of the class. Alright, we don't need to have the period. The period dot color red is the class selector. Alright, so the period is used when that class is used as a selector. When we're manipulating classes, we refer to just the name. And here again, you would need to actually go into the Firebug, and you would see that that class was added, and notice that the browser adds it inline. It doesn't add it to the style, to the embedded style sheet. It adds it as an inline element, attribute. We can also remove a class. So here we have the same H2, and we previously set a class. So using the h2selector.removeClass, here again, we pass it the value of the color name. We can remove that class. Now notice how the generated code looks. Now we have the class attribute and there just is no value. So once you add it, that class attribute stays there. You're essentially manipulating, adding and removing that name. All right, sometimes it might be a good idea before we start adding and removing classes to see if it actually exists, because maybe if it exists, then you might want to remove it, and vice versa. All right, we have a hasClass method, and that returns true or false. All right, so let's take a look in the bottom here. In our H2, we have a class coded in, class equals color red, and in our embedded style sheet, that class is defined. Now we have this alert. Our selector h2.hasClass color red. So that expression is going to return true or false. So if we put this expression inside an alert and run it, indeed it will return true because yes, that does have that class. A very, very nice, popular method, the toggleClass method. All right, so let's take a look in our code here. We have a click event. Our selector is some kind of a button, and when we click on the button, we're calling the anonymous function. The code to be run is the selector h2 dot toggleClass color red. All right, what does that mean? A toggle is an on and off switch. That means essentially when I click, because it's being called from the click event, when I click on that function, when I click on that H2, it will add the color red class and remove it. Add it and remove it. Add it and remove it. So that's what toggleClass does. It toggles between the addClass method and the removeClass method based on that class name. So if the class name is there, it removes it. If it isn't there, it adds it. Now notice, because the H2 is the selector, that clicking is going to apply to every H2 in the document. So if I have 3 H2s, and if I click on any one of them, it's going to toggle all 3 of them, because we're essentially applying this method to H2, meaning it's every existence of the H2 element. Now, a very nice way around this is to use the keyword this. This represents the current instance of the selector that essentially you are manipulating, and in this situation, it is the instance of the H2 we're clicking on. So this is the exact same code as from before. Here we have our H2 selector and we're clicking on it. We're calling the anonymous function, and in this case, rather than saying h2.toggleClass, we're saying this, and notice there is no parentheses around it, no quotations. This is a JavaScript keyword, and it refers to whichever H2 we are actually clicking on. So because the selector is H2, any H2 that is clicked on, this function will run, but only for that specific H2. So if you were to look at the bottom here, the first one, we see the class being toggled, but not the second one. The next method here, again, commonly called a traversal method. Next gets the next sibling, or the next sibling of a certain type, if there is a certain type as a parameter passed to the parentheses. All right, so let's take a look in our HTML. Here's our unordered list. We have 4 LIs. The third LI has a class equals third. So in our selector, in our jQuery statement, this is our selector, li.third, that's the class, .next. All right, so that's the next sibling, which would be the 4th LI, list item 4, addClass, color red. And if you look at the output there, you can see that yes, indeed, it has turned red. So the next nice easy way of getting to the next sibling. Just as there is next, there is previous. Here again, these are also called traversal methods, and there are more of them, and we will look at them later on in this class. So here is the same UL, and rather than adding the class to the next, we will add it to the previous, which is the immediately preceding, and if you notice, it will add it to list item 2. The each function, very, very nice. The each method, excuse me, it takes a function, all right? And what it does, it will loop through each occurrence of the selector and run that function. So it's a built-in loop for that selector. So if we had an li and we wanted to make all of them red, the color red, execute the CSS method and put the color red, we could do it using the each function. And if you notice here again, we're looking at the output, and you can see that indeed it did set the style there. This would be a good way of testing if a condition occurred for every instance of a certain selection. Okay, the hide method. And we will look at this again in the next chapter. It is also referred to as an effect. It essentially hides something. It does not take any parameters. Well, now it does not take any parameters. Display : none. This is a CSS display property, and essentially that is what this is doing behind the scenes. It is setting the display property to none. So if in my code here, my first line of code, if I'm clicking on a button, there's my button selector .click. I'm clicking on a button and I'm running this anonymous function, and there's my selector #paral1, so there's an ID somewhere, .hide. That will hide it. In addition to hide, we also have show. And what show is actually doing behind the scenes is setting the display property to block. So here we have that button, and if we click on it, there's our selector #paral1 .show. We would just show it. So these are two nice little built-in methods for hiding and showing. We have already looked at the click event, also known as an event method, and there are some others. The ready event, we're familiar with that. Now, the unload and the error event, they were deprecated. All right. The click event we're familiar with. The toggle event is also deprecated. And here again, the author refers to these as event methods. All right, so this is the click event method, and we have looked at this before. So here we're inside our ready event. And if I click on this button, ID button, BTN, and I execute some code, that code will be executed every time I click the button. That's just the way it is, right? Now, there is another event method in jQuery called the one method. And that will confine that code to being run only once, which might be very valuable. The hover event method, here again referred to also as a compound event, takes two functions. The hover essentially allows you to run a function for a mouse over and a mouse out. I understand that certain of these things we can do with CSS. So let's take a look at the syntax here. Here we have an h2 selector .hover. This is an event method. Notice where it starts, notice where it ends. It takes two functions as parameters, the first function and the second function. The first function is essentially for the mouse over. The second function is essentially for the mouse out. They are separated by a comma. The toggle event method, which has been deprecated, works the same way. It is essentially was a compound event, taking two functions. So let's take a look at where the toggle event method starts and ends. The first function is essentially for the first click, comma. The second function is for the second click. Alright, so let's take a look at this bind event method, which is a bit more advanced. First, let's take a look at the bottom of our slide. Here we have a traditional click event method. Very easy. We just execute the code inside the anonymous function when the click event happens. Now, the bind event essentially wraps all that. So here we have the opening bind and the closing bind. We have the name of the event and the anonymous function. Now, the bind event can be useful for calling a named function. So here at the top of our slide we have a function called changeRed. And if we wanted to bind that to the click event, this is how we would do it using the bind event method. Another advantage of the bind method, and remember bind was replaced by on, another advantage is that you can attach multiple events and multiple handlers. Alright, so here's my selector #paral1, and I have the bind event method. Inside the code to be executed in the curly braces, if I am calling a click event, I will execute a certain function. Notice the syntax. So this is the first event and handler that we're calling, and that will be separated by a comma. Now we can call another event and handler. We can do something when we click on that selection. We can do something when we mouse over it. We could do something when we mouse off it. We could do something when we double click, etc. So the bind allows us to attach multiple events and handlers, which are functions. We also can bind two events to the same function or handler. So here we have our selector paral1.bind, and supposing I wanted to call the same function on the click and on the double click, this is how I would call it.